In this video, I'll be telling scary stories from Reddit while playing Minecraft in the background. Why not? Let's get started with the first story. It happened about 10 years ago. My best friend from childhood, Steve, passed away unexpectedly. We'd been apart for a long time, but we recently got back together. Steve hated technology. And I mean hated it, whether it was on the computer or the local phone. All he needed was a TV with an antenna and a landline. I was on the team when he learned of his passing. Since he had no family and hadn't been in touch with them for a while, no one immediately noticed his absence. The fact that he remained unchanged for so long still haunts me. When I got home, I was sent back to Texas for training. While sitting in class, I felt my phone vibrate. A name appeared on the screen, Steve. A chill ran through me. I couldn't answer during class, so I called back later. As expected, no one picked up. I worked in satellite communications and understood call routing and forwarding. Perhaps the number had already been transferred to someone else, or someone accidentally pressed it on an old phone. But the incident still struck me as incredibly strange. I don't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but this story still makes me think and reconsider some of my beliefs. I don't know what you would have done, but I would have definitely tried to pick up the phone right away because you never know what could happen. On to the second story. I'm not an unbeliever, I just don't usually dwell on it because I don't want to see anything myself. So, as far as I know, nothing out of the ordinary has happened to me. Last October, my father committed suicide during Hurricane Milton. I live in Maine and he lives in Florida. My husband and I drove from Maine for 3 days, and I couldn't find a place to stay because the hotels weren't answering my phone because of the hurricane. I started looking for places to stay on Airbnb, talking to people, and found a place. After driving for 3 days and getting there around 7:30 at night, I was a little scared because the place was kind of creepy, and I didn't want to stay there. My husband was tired from driving, and I felt like it was going to turn into an argument, so I said, "Why don't we just stay here tonight and we'll find somewhere else to stay tomorrow?" He, I, and our dog collapsed onto the bed, and he and our dog fell asleep right away. Knowing I probably wouldn't fall asleep, I started reading a book on my phone. Around 3:30 a.m., I heard a knocking sound that correlated with the phrase, "shave and haircut in a couple of minutes." Sorry to those young and who don't know what I'm talking about. Very faint, not like a knock on a door or a window, but just coming from inside the house. Since I was already afraid to stay there, I was really scared. It was so faint that I even imagined it when I heard it again. I put the phone down and listened carefully. A few moments later, it happened again, and I decided that if it happened again, I would wake my husband and we would leave. It didn't happen again, and at some point, I fell asleep. The next morning, I told my husband about it. We then found a hotel to stay in, spent a few days there dealing with the situation, and then headed back to Maine. On the way back, we stopped at my mom's place in South Carolina for the night. When we arrived, she was cooking dinner and noticed we must be very tired, so she suggested we lie down until dinner was ready and she would wake us up. It was around 4:30 p.m. I didn't tell her or her husband this story. They have an apartment attached to their house with a separate entrance, which is where we were staying. We went over and lay down, and almost immediately, we both heard the knocking again. But this time, it was very loud and right behind our heads on the wall, and we didn't hear it again. I told my mom about it later, and when I demonstrated the knocking, my dog went crazy from the noise. But she had been there both times the knocking actually happened and didn't react at all. This is truly creepy. I can't imagine being in an unfamiliar place and hearing something like that at 3:30 a.m. It would definitely freak me out. But I won't stop there. Let's continue. The third story goes like this. Both my brothers, my mother, and my stepfather can attest to this shared experience. When I was little, about 6 to 8 years old, we lived in a very old and creepy 2-story house. Several of my stepfather's friends also lived there because the house was huge. My room was to the left of the top of the stairs and had no door. and my brothers lived across the hall. The stairs had a door at the top and bottom, which I closed before bed because it gave me a sense of security. This house used to belong to our relative Earl, who tragically died in the room where I slept. My family didn't tell me about it until I was older, but later it clarified a lot. Every night around 10 or 11 p.m., we would hear loud footsteps slowly ascending the stairs until they reached my floor, and then start again from the bottom. This continued until 4 a.m. The footsteps were so real and frightening that I wanted to hide under the covers. My brothers, mother, and stepfather also heard this sound, and my younger brother said he saw people in the house at night. One day I opened the door to the landing and turned on the light. The footsteps stopped. But as soon as I returned to the room, they started again. Sometimes my mother would joke, "Earl, go to bed," and the footsteps would fade. This incident forever changed our attitudes toward mysticism and the afterlife. The house was torn down, and I took a few burnt bricks as a souvenir. I've believed in ghosts ever since. It's hard to even imagine what it's like to hear footsteps in the house at night. I certainly wouldn't have slept soundly. But let's not get scared and move on to story 4. My husband and I live with our dog, Baloo, in a large, detached house in the countryside. A few months ago, my husband went away for the weekend, and I was left alone with him. The thought of spending the night there alone made me a little nervous, but Baloo's presence gave me a feeling of security. One night, around 2 in the morning, I was awakened by a strange sound. It sounded like a faint scratching or scraping. I'm a very light sleeper and usually wake up at the slightest noise. Half asleep, I thought it was a marten or some other small animal scratching outside the house, so I got up to close the window. But when I got there, I discovered it was already closed. I listened and noticed the sound was coming from inside, not outside. I immediately thought Baloo was scratching at the door, trying to get into the bedroom. So I opened the door to the living room. Baloo lay awake in his bed, ears pricked up, staring at me. By then, I was fully awake. The scratching was getting louder. I turned on the light in the living room. The sound seemed to be coming from inside the wall. I held my breath and froze. Baloo suddenly jumped up, growled, ran to the wall, and started scratching. My fear intensified. I remembered that my sister, who lives with her family in the house next door, had said I could always call if anything happened. Since it was the weekend, I assumed she was still awake. I returned to the bedroom to grab the phone and call her. Just as I was about to dial, Baloo suddenly barked loudly. I rushed back into the living room and saw him at the far end, staring down the dark hallway. I shouted, "Baloo, stop!" But he didn't stop barking. Then, out of nowhere, he darted straight into the dark hallway. There was silence, and then I heard a loud crash coming from the stairs. At that moment, I was sure someone had broken into the house. Panicked, I called out to Baloo, and he came running to me, whining. I quickly closed the door behind us and called 911. The house was completely silent again. The scratching stopped. Only Baloo was quietly whining next to me. Panicked, I told the dispatcher that I thought someone was robbing the house. The police were on their way. Since Baloo was still restless and whining, I stroked his back to calm him down. Then I realized he was covered in blood. He had a large open wound on his side. I froze in shock. Unwilling to leave the bedroom, I grabbed all the clothes I could find and pressed them against the wound to stop the bleeding. After what seemed like an eternity, the police finally arrived. Baloo was rushed to the veterinary clinic, and the house was thoroughly searched. But the officers found nothing. There was no sign of forced entry. All entrances and exits were securely locked. According to the police, the house was impossible to enter. I spent the rest of the night at my sister's. Luckily, Baloo's wound was stitched up, and he's doing well today. The vet said the wound was most likely caused by external force, and looked like he'd been scratched by a bear's claws. I still can't explain what happened that night, and every time I think about it, a shiver runs down my spine. I don't even know how this story can be justified, considering the police confirmed it was impossible to enter the house and there were no traces. At least the dog's owner acted quickly and the dog was saved. The next story will also be pretty creepy, so let's hear it. When I was about 11 years old, my family of 6, and I had just moved from a tiny one-bedroom house to a 3-bedroom house. It was pretty peaceful and without any problems. About a month or two later, it was late at night, and given the location of my room relative to the rest of the house, it had a direct view of the backyard. My mom had hung lacy white curtains that didn't really block anything. But since I was afraid of the dark and our dog slept in front of the back door, it didn't bother me too much. Anyway, fast forward to that night, it was late, and I could very clearly hear my sister and dad snoring. All the doors were open, and even though my back was to the wall, I would have heard if anyone had entered my room. It wasn't very quiet, especially in that unavoidable place I had to pass to get to my bed. Still facing the wall, I suddenly felt this strange, hyper-protective urge to hug my sister. She was on the other side of the room, clearly asleep. I could hear her. Still feeling that overwhelming urge, I felt my whole body freeze as a hand, literally a hand, touched the top of my head. I couldn't scream, I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. The hand was strangely warm and gentle as it rested on my head for what felt like hours. I simply panicked because I knew it wasn't my sister because she was snoring. It wasn't my dad because he snored loudly too, and if it were, I would usually see the light in the hallway because my mother didn't like wandering around the house in the dark. I could also hear my brothers groaning when she did this because their room was at an odd angle to the hallway. At one point, I felt like crying too, when I felt fingers gently scratching my scalp before finally moving my hand. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear the floorboards creak. I didn't hear any movement. It must have taken me about an hour to fully come out of that stupor, and when it did, I got out of bed and went to my sister. She was fine, but the sight of her, somehow, made me silently give in. I quietly went to tell my mom and dad what had happened, and they chalked it up to a dream. Firstly, our dog hadn't warned us. She's very aggressive with strangers. And secondly, it could have been a dream. Being a rational person, I somewhat agreed. After that, I didn't pay much attention to it until a week later, when I returned from school to find the police outside the house. Panicked, thinking primarily about my sister's safety, I ran to my parents. They were with all my brothers and sisters, which reassured me, and after calming down, I asked what had happened. It turned out we'd discovered a 2-story shed in the backyard. My father needed to take some tools upstairs, and when he did, he bumped into a dirty, frail woman. She just smiled indifferently, said my sister was beautiful, and asked if he needed her by any chance. I'm still shaken by this, and the memories of that night haunt me to this day. Please, always check that the windows and doors are closed. How could they even sleep when they have another person living with them, basically, who bothers them at night? But that last piece of advice is actually very good. Always check that the windows and doors are closed. On to the next story. I have 2 stories that happened to me about 20 years ago. My parents were getting divorced, and the atmosphere at home was not pleasant. They were constantly arguing and fighting. Both incidents happened when I was 9 or 10 years old. So I don't remember which happened first. My father had been working in IT since the early 80s. So I learned almost everything I knew back then from him. I was a bit ahead in technical knowledge for my age and for that time. He had an office in the basement, and the house was large and new, 4 stories. He always left for work and didn't return until after 5 p.m. So no one really used the office, and at the time, it was my testing ground. That day, as usual, everyone was on other floors, and I was sitting at the computer, browsing some strange websites, let's just say these rotten websites should be a warning sign for some of you. And I swear, I suddenly heard this damned, indescribable demonic roar, mixed with a slight chuckle, right above my right ear. It wasn't quiet or muffled, and I'm 100% deaf on the right side, but I distinctly felt the sound vibrating on my skull and a light breeze in my ear, like someone whispering. There were no windows at all. It was underground, and the walls were thick, not an American house, but a well-insulated, thick, new and modern Swiss house. There was no sound on the computer, no video playing in the background either. And I know and distinguish when sound is coming from the screen stereo system because I can hear perfectly well with my other ear. It was such a sudden and strange roar, and I can more or less reproduce it if someone asks. But I absolutely cannot describe it in words. My brain instantly understood everything, and damn, I've never moved so fast in my life as I did that day. If there was a day I could beat Usain Bolt, it was that one. It took me months to go down there again and feel safe, but I haven't felt that way since. I kept glancing around and pretending not to pay attention to the computer, so I'd be prepared in case something weird happened again. The nannies we had back then also reported strange things, and my younger brother, he was 6 at the time, once came down from the 4th floor, crying and panicking after seeing a big black guy enter one of the little doors where the toys were stored. The entire 4th floor was our playroom, and on either side of the room were 2 of these little storage rooms. Only they led nowhere and contained only toys. The second strange thing happened to both of us. We were sleeping when we suddenly heard a bell ring in the middle of the room. The sound was so distinct that we both heard it. At first, it didn't bother us much. We just thought it might be a toy or something else forgotten in our room. And from that day on, that damn bell started ringing every night, always at the same time. What was also strange was that every time it rang, we both suddenly woke up, either from exhaustion or something else, in the middle of the night. My mom and grandma also heard it when they decided to come into our bed to check. We never figured out what it was. Even after we cleaned everything and left only 2 mattresses in the room, it kept ringing. My grandma, a very religious person, started praying every night before the ringing, and after a few months, it disappeared. But a few months later, it reappeared in the new apartment we moved to after my parents' divorce. It was 200 kilometers from where we lived before. This time, he disappeared again after fervent and repeated prayers, and fortunately, never returned. I've been writing this for years, considering all possible external factors like noise from a computer, outside, etc. But the neighboring houses weren't built together, and in the 90s, it was impossible to pull such a prank on several people, especially repeatedly, like in the ringing episode. It was possible if something was hidden well. But we took everything out, and the sound always came from the middle of the room and didn't go away, even after moving to another state. I get goosebumps when I think back to that period of my life. Paranormal or not, it was a truly difficult time for everyone. Both of his stories are pretty creepy, but the second one is completely unbelievable. It doesn't seem like a coincidence anymore. Even reading it makes me feel uneasy, especially when you realize everyone in the family heard it, not just one person. Let's move on to the last story, the most terrifying one, in my opinion. When I was 13, some older boys I'd befriended, including my best friend, took us out onto a dirt road in the woods. We lived in the suburbs, and told us that if we kept going, we'd end up in a Ku Klux Klan camp. They told us we should try to act normal because we were white, but if we kept going, we'd end up in some biker hangout where we should never go alone, ever. Bad things happened to girls there, really bad things. We thought they were just trying to scare us, but there was a seriousness in one of the boys' voices that told me he was telling the truth. They called it Pig Palace. Fast forward 30 years, and that place turned out to be a dark image where a serial killer fed his victims to the pigs on his farm. Robert Pickton was one of the last brothers, and most likely the victim of many deaths, but he enjoyed torturing women by abandoning them, beating them unconscious, passing them around, drugging them, etc. He was also sent to downtown Vancouver to transport women to the farm for others, and for himself. I doubt he was a victim. He only had one brother and an older sister, who lived separately. Their parents died in the late 1970s, so it was just him and his brother running the farm. I doubt he killed all the victims identified by DNA, but I don't doubt he was unaware of them. He was more likely to promote his low-cost waste disposal business for HA than anyone else who used him as a victim. At a minimum, that's accessory to murder, and in my opinion, that and the blood are the reason male DNA was found on the unidentified victims. But what about the women? He wouldn't be sent to pick up women. He'd pick them up himself, offer them work, perhaps entertaining guests at a party or doing something else he thought would lure them into his car, drive them there, then torture them to death and feed them to his pigs. Sometimes they'd be sent to a recycling center. The charges against him for the remaining 20 murders were dropped not because he was innocent, but because he'd already served the maximum sentence, 6 years. And for juries and courts to hear the rest of these monstrous, man-made viruses would be cruel to the jury and a waste of taxpayer money, since it would take 2 years to get another 20 convictions. Now, the evidence against him was strong. This guy was constantly grabbing for dead women. The police were completely powerless until the report of one of his victims, who escaped after he stabbed her multiple times, was dismissed due to her history of drug use. Street robbers acted more cautiously, traveling in pairs to avoid becoming his victims, unlike the police, who, when other robbers reported him, never cared about his victims. Calling him a simpleton is doing a disservice to the dead. This guy deserved to rot in the grave much longer than he did. Glad he's dead. It gives me chills to think that as a child, you could have been so close to such a place and not even know it. And on that terrifying note, I'll end these stories and videos. There have been some pretty scary and terrifying stories from other people. If you'd like to share any of your own stories, email them to me in the description, and I'll share them in future videos. Until then, good luck.